since we're already relatively late in the evening, I actually suggest, if you guys don't mind, to move on to the question and answer period. If anyone needs a quick comfort break, sneak out, come back quietly. But if I could ask our three guests to the front table here, and we'll take it straight from there. You don't have to wait. Yeah, I want to open this up to any questions you have. If you don't mind, just quickly mentioning your name, introduce yourself so we know who you are, where you come from. And Lisa has a microphone. Lisa will make you get some answers.
My name is Charlie Adler. I'm a public assistant rather from Attleboro, attending these lectures. Question, I think, for Larry. You have really quantified a lot of the cost that's going to be incurred as a result of climate change. And one thing I've been looking for in these lectures is to find arguments to get policymakers to move to prevent or mitigate climate change. It seems like you have put your finger on a lot of big numbers of potential or actual costs. Now, despite the fact that a lot of these perhaps are costs that we can avoid, even with minimal climate change, still, do you think that you see costs of such magnitude that it should be a no-brainer to take decisive action to tax carbon, let's say?
Well, I don't think these are on. Oh, there you can see it.
No.
The problem with sea level rise is that if you turn off CO2 tomorrow, the oceans are going to keep rising. It's a 100,000-year process. So that's a real challenge. You tell people you got this problem with sea level rise, specifically mitigating CO2 isn't going to make any difference. And that's what we're trying to, how do you communicate that? And how do you talk about that? In our community, we don't talk about mitigation. It's just how do you deal with sea level rise? It's really two separate issues. This is where climate change communicators need to help out.
So we have two questions on the left-hand side. Yeah, Lisa, while you're getting the microphone up, I also wanted just on the side to make another comment. Sea level rise is somewhat different from some of the other
absolutely
impacts, and there are some cases in which you can combine mitigation and adaptation in a very cost-effective way, decentralize the power grid, use renewable resources, cut down on the carbon footprint, and be less susceptible to extreme events.
I'm not saying you shouldn't mitigate.
No, I think
it's one thing.
So my question was, one of my friends is doing a startup, and his idea is to educate 1 billion people, and these are people in parts of the world that don't have an education. When you're doing games like these, it is easy for us to have it, you're teaching us, you've got some content online, is it as effective? And then, for me, I've understood the story of climate change, and you've then also done one for insurance and others. Do you have a plan of a life game, basically, where you have one game tied into the next game, tied into the next, so you could understand multiple views, which in the end would give you one big game called life?
Good. It would be great to play that game. It has not been easy to get people to allocate time at the institutional level to show up and play a game, or to log online and you get an email saying come join this game. Chances are that either if you're really in trouble, if you're a subsistence farmer in Ethiopia, you don't have electricity, and if you have electricity, you claim you're busy doing other things. Games are changing because of their proven success. Every time we play a game session, people have a blast, and they remember, and they learn, and they like it. So we're getting more and more invitations to do these things. Now, to answer your question about your multiple questions, my task is to help the Red Cross and the people we serve understand and address these problems. So most of the time I have a captive audience. The games we have designed with the little brain power we have been for those circumstances. We have no money, and it's very expensive to design an online game, right? You need to hire programmers. That's a lot of money per unit time. Any of you game programmers willing to volunteer your time or get a thesis with us? Come talk to me. Other organizations have done online games very successfully. They're awesome. Most of them about mitigation of climate change. Very little about hurricane preparedness. That is changing, and we're trying to help on that. On the sequencing, yes, we have designed about 30, 35 games, and whenever we have a captive audience for more than half a day, we sequence the games depending on the target audience. You're not going to run a hurricane game in Ethiopia, and you're not going to run an agriculture game in the shanty towns of Guatemala. So you cannot have one game that is good for everything. There are too many differences, and that's the challenge, to tailor the needs, opportunities, etc., build the capacity. But we need to move in that direction, and we are doing it more slowly than we need to, but much faster than we had dreamed a year ago. So it's coming.
Great, there was another hand here to the, just a few rows down. Lisa. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for 3 wonderful presentations, and there are lots of good questions that could come. I hope someone will ask a question of Brian. I can't think of a good one, but there's fascinating information there, and I'd love to learn more. My question is for Larry, and it really is comparing the United States and maybe this is political will is the way of describing it, comparing the United States with Europe. And my very simplistic sense is that Europe has had more political will to sort of take the mitigation steps and to be more proactive on what is quite clear that we need to deal with, and what can we learn from Europe to sort of accelerate the pace of responsible preparation in the U.S.
Two things. Thank you. We have funding from the EU actually to bring European people who are good at adaptation communication in the U.S. to start to compare. And one of the topics is that exact thing, the psychological and differences between the U.S. and the European countries. Obviously, we're not Holland. You don't tell farmers to leave, and no question about it, or people to move. So we're doing that. Also, just to mention that the Dutch companies and the Dutch government are very aggressive about showing us how we can do things the Dutch way. It's called Ditch or Dutch. Just go ahead and search for that phrase, you'll find it.
Monica Congra, PhD student at Northeastern. This question is for Mr. Pablo Suarez. So during your extensive experience and travels all around the world, have you encountered any preoccupation from the private sector on the physical impacts of climate change in their supply chains, the raw materials that might be produced in those countries and maybe being transported in other countries? So if you have any insights on that.
Yes, decidedly so, and let me be candid in that I grew up in a cultural context where private sector was bad. Those evil imperialist money-seeking, Draculas and so on. And now the evidence is helping me change. I have been working with the insurance sector, with reinsurance. I heard someone from that sector say, it was only $1 billion, not enough to move our interest. So these people have money. And they do the math, and they have been seeing for very long that climate poses problems to insurance and reinsurance because more disasters means more payouts, and then it's trouble. Agriculture, including commercial agriculture, has been very actively learning. Coca-Cola they need water to make Coke, and they have been researching 50 years down the road which are the places that may start running out of water, and to ensure that they get access to the water they need. Of course, whenever there's scarcity of resources, if there's not enough water for everyone and Coke gets it, someone doesn't, so we need to make sure that there's conversations about who does what. Infrastructure developers, that's as a former engineer, I see how it's much simpler if you're a company that makes money out of selling a highway. It's much easier to say, I make a highway, you give me the money, that's the highway, goodbye. Climate has changed, the highway is washed away, not my problem. But in time and with evidence, engineers are recognizing that we have to do something. And the World Bank, FAO, many others are looking, even the humanitarian sector. Oxfam America has been a leader on this, on linking the private sector with humanitarian development sector. I really encourage you to look at the work they have been doing with mining companies, with textiles, with cotton. I don't know the details, but in short, if you help the private sector understand what's likely to happen and what can be done about it in a way that is good and profitable for the company, while also being good for the people that need it. We now have Ethiopian illiterate farmers covered by insurance, and because of that, they don't go hungry next time there's a drought. That's a brilliant example, but way more could be done.
Actually, I want to quick jump in on this. There's actually a lot going on in the U.S. kind of under the radar. I co-chair the Adaptation Working Group for the Association of Climate Change Officers, which brings together sustainability officers from Fortune 500 companies. And a lot of it goes unrecognized. UPS, for example, is doing a lot, looking at supply chain, as you intimate, and reducing transportation costs. And so, because of the kind of rancor in political discussion in this country, that doesn't kind of float to the top, but it really is starting to make a difference in U.S. businesses as well. And this partnership between NGOs and the academic community and the private sector is really solidifying. I think you showed the National Climate Assessment reports. This is now, and it was mandated by Congress, and it's an ongoing effort now. It used to be every 4 years we'd issue a report. Now it's a continuing process, and they're engaging stakeholders from Fortune 500 companies, from stakeholders all across the spectrum to solve these problems. And so it's really starting to take off, if not at the federal level, but in the private sector here in the U.S. So I found that really encouraging.
We have time for one more question.
I have it.
Great.
So Brian, you talked about species that are going to do well, such as mosquitoes, and I assume rats are going to do just fine too. One of the reasons we care, thinking just of ourselves about whether mussels and oysters and other things live, is because we eat them. So, are there any in your line with the cow? Are there edible species that are going to do well? Because we always hear about shortages in food, but are there any that will thrive?
What's that?
A jelly burger.
A jelly burger, exactly. Yeah, jellyfish do really, really well. There's a push to eat lionfish now. Lionfish are invading along the east coast of the U.S. and there's a group of chefs that is pushing to eat invasive species. But I mean, things like tilapia do very well. There are a number of potential aquaculture species that have these pretty broad tolerances that should do pretty well. The other way to think about this is, depending on where you are, not all change is bad. I mean, it's going to really suck for us when all our wheat moves to Canada. But that may be good for the Canadians until we invade them.
If I can share an entertaining story, it's not just absolute doing well relative to climate, but also relatively compared to the other competing species. This is a story from Bangladesh by my colleagues from CARE International. And I love this story. It's such a beautiful illustration of how we could do things. Community in Bangladesh, they have chickens. Main source of protein, egg and chicken meat. They have chickens, they eat chickens. Sometimes there's a big flood. If you survive, chances are your chickens don't. And then the Red Crescent helps, and you don't starve to death, water's received, you don't have anything, you get help from your family, from your nephew who's working in the capital city. They send you some money or some chicks, and you slowly start rebuilding the stock, and then you have chickens and you eat, and then after 7 years the next flood comes and all goes again. Now with climate change, sea level rise and so on, the floods are coming so frequently that they have no chance to rebuild the stock of chickens that the next shock comes and they're hungry and the Red Crescent has to go give food aid and so on. So there was a workshop. How can we deal with this problem of chickens drowning, no protein, health problems and so on? And there was a workshop and all sorts of ideas were coming out and the men were dominating, as is often the case, both at the community level and at the government or IPCC, anywhere men tend to dominate. And not many awesome ideas come up until the ladies start talking. One of the ladies said, how about substituting some of our chickens with ducks? So what happens? The chicken drowns, the duck floats. Right? Now, if you had brought this idea to my colleagues in academia, we'd have started talking about mathematical models of chicken flotation, high-tech vests for helping them float and so on. Now, I was working at a village in Malawi called Mfunga that had a similar problem. Chickens flooding, chickens drown, no nutrition, what do we do? And I showed them a photo of this Bangladeshi lady, very different, you know, with a red dot over here and so on, with her happy ducks, happy lady. And I said, this is something that they have done, I don't know if it's useful for you. Next year I go back, I go in the dry season to stay away from malaria. I was wearing my sandals, it's really hot, life expectancy 39, okay, in Mfunga. So these people are in trouble. Take away their chickens, they're in even more trouble. I was giving a workshop with the Deputy Director of Communication of the Meteorological Service on climate risk management. A duck was pecking my toes. It was the most magnificent story of adaptation to climate change, transcontinental, and guess what? That village of Mfunga was selling ducks to neighboring villages that also had a flooding problem. So private sector.
So they're not just losers, they're all winners. And on that note, Pablo, you promised we identify the winners of the game.
Teams, stand up if you have one bean or more as a team. Stay standing if as a team you have 2 beans or more, otherwise sit down. 3 beans or more. So all teams have 2 beans, so you'll have to share. When the session is over, come up front and we'll give you the prizes. And congratulations, by the way.
Since we're talking ducks, beans, and Pringles, our next round of the Open Classroom and Climate Change Challenges and Solutions will focus on food security challenges. And we'll have Molly Anderson, who actually for many years here was at Tufts University here in Boston, and John Riley. Both of those will talk about different aspects of the food security challenges and associated solutions that we could put in place. And I want to invite you for that and look forward to seeing you next week.